Okay, so good afternoon to all, and welcome to this webinar about EUCS, Draft Candidate European Cybersecurity Certification Scheme for Cloud Services. My name is Eric Vétillard. I am a certification expert at ENISA, and I am leading the work on this scheme and chairing the ad hoc working group related to that scheme. About this webinar, it is organized in two parts. First, I will give an overview of the scheme, and then there will be some answers to the questions from the public. So about the questions, what we would ask you to do is to use the Q&A tab to ask your questions. This is where we will get the questions that we answered during the webinar. We will strive to answer all of the questions that you ask. Maybe during the webinar, or if there are too many, we will continue after the webinar in a less interactive manner. So about the agenda. For the first part of the talk, we will start by looking at where we stand right now, about how we came to that candidate scheme, then provide some information about the draft candidate scheme, and finally take a little look at the challenges that remain ahead of us. So we're basically about 1 year after the request, 10 months after the beginning of the work in the ad hoc working group. And now, there is an advanced draft available. I hope that you all had access to it and started reading it. So we have done a significant amount of work, but also a lot of work remains. So to give you some context, the initial request from the Commission was motivated by the enablement of the free flow of information in Europe. It followed the preparatory work from the CSP CERT group under the control of the Commission, which, among other things, recommended to cover all the cloud services and all assurance levels defined in the Cybersecurity Act. CSP CERT also identified a few potential difficulties, most of them consequences of the absence of a clear reference. So we did start our work with two major assessment methods with many sources for security requirements and with a scope that remained to be clarified. So roughly 1 year after getting that request, there is now a draft candidate scheme available for review. It provides the answers to the questions in Article 54 of the Cybersecurity Act, which are the key elements of a certification scheme. And it also contains definitions for assessment methodologies and for requirements for security controls. Some of the details of the scheme are still under discussion. For instance, about assessment methodologies and document templates. But we also managed to include additional recommendations. For instance, about the handling of the cloud supply chain, and also about the adoption of the scheme and the transition from existing schemes. There is still a lot of work to do. A few things are missing from the body of the scheme, such as the format of the certificates. We also have some parts like the complements on the supply chain that need some more work, and all of the sections here need more polishing. This is the most urgent work that we have left, because this is a precondition for the work on an implementing act. So it has a direct impact on the availability of the scheme. The annexes also need a general consolidation, and there are still a few missing parts that need to be developed. However, this is slightly less urgent because some of this work could continue in parallel with the development of the implementing act by the Commission. Finally, we will need to produce guidance. This will happen in the next phase, but it is a mandatory complement to the scheme, as it will contain all the elements that are too detailed or too volatile to be included in the regulation. It will become a reference for all stakeholders. And as we will see later, this is also continuous work. As the guidance will need to keep evolving to reflect the evolution of the threats and of the technologies. So let's now move to the draft candidate scheme. First, a little warning or forward here. The scheme, including all the annexes, is a formal document. And it's not really obvious at all times to identify our intentions when reading the scheme. So the goal of this presentation here is not to give you a full overview of the scheme, but to give you keys to actually read the full document and get the best out of it. So among the challenges you'll find in the document, some information needs to be connected. The scheme components are often refined in the annexes, so you need to go back and forth between them. Some of the components and annexes refer to guidance, but the guidance is not defined yet, so you can't even go back and forth. You have to imagine what the guidance will be. The connections also between some chapters are not always completely obvious, so this is something where it's important to maybe have an idea about what the intention was when writing it. Another thing is that, of course, some of the information is very formal. The requirements on the controls, they've been sliced into bits to match the levels, and they are described using a language that is as formal as we can get. And the consequences of that is that, of course, there are some many advantages, some of them being that we are unambiguous, or at least less ambiguous. But another consequence is that it doesn't really easily. So it can be quite boring at times, I admit. The assessment methods also are defined quite formally. It also combines vocabulary from several sources. So you have to be very careful about how you read things and making sure that you link to the various terminologies. In terms of the principles behind the scheme, these principles have been the focus of the first part of the work of the ad hoc working group, especially around the spring. But most of the decisions then when taken before the summer of 2020. So among other things, we show some definitions about cloud services, with the ISO IEC 17788. We defined how the three assurance levels were supposed to look like. We determined that the assessment methods should be somehow combinable with both ISO and ISAE audits. And the requirements on the controls were to be inspired from standard, such as 27,000 series, and from national schemes. However, there are a few key discussions that have continued until more or less the end of 2020. Some of them were about the structure and the requirements on the security controls. Others about the organization and the details on the assessment methodology, how to achieve this overarching goal of being combinable with different kinds of audits. And of course, right before issuing the draft, we revisited our definition of the levels in order to incorporate into it what we have developed over the last few months. And that was done in December. In terms of the subject matter of the scheme, this is about cloud services. So important thing is to first define what that is. And of course, there are many different definitions of the clouds in different schemes, in reports, in regulations. So in our case, we decided to refer to the standard IOC IEC 17788, which defines terminology for the cloud. So cloud computing here is quite standard definition, paradigm for enabling network access to a scalable and elastic pool of shareable physical or virtual resources, well, self-service provisioning and administration on demand. And see from that definition that we have all the typical adjectives that define cloud computing, including an explicit reference to scalability and elasticity. But then if you look at how we define a cloud service, it's just one or more capabilities offered via cloud computing involved using a defined interface. And that means that you don't necessarily need to have scalability and elasticity at the level of the service themselves. You just need to have built your service on top of a scalable and elastic cloud computing environment. Another important thing about the definition of a cloud service is that when we mean a cloud service, we cannot mean only an information security management system. A cloud service goes beyond just a management system, and in particular, a cloud service includes something that is being operated, that includes some features, some security mechanisms, and of course, these security features and security mechanisms are fully in scope of the certification. Lastly, a cloud service includes a full stack. So the idea here is that independently of how a developer for a cloud service has decided to implement their cloud service, whether they are themselves implementing the full stack or whether they are using sub-service providers to provide them part of the service, for instance, cloud infrastructure, they're supposed to be evaluated in the same way, audited in the same way. So that means that we need to make sure that we correctly take into consideration the full cloud supply chain. So in terms of vocabulary, we have two main sources. The main source for vocabulary is standards, in particular the ISO IEC 17000. And that's mostly because, of course, the scheme is based on 17065, as hinted by the Cybersecurity Act. So this is naturally the main source of vocabulary for the scheme. And this is where we draw definitions for the organization of the conformity assessments, for roles, tasks. We have complemented that with other standards. So we've used ISO 9000 for more general definitions, but also 27005, 29007, and a few more for more specific information. In addition, we also have been using international audit standards, mostly because they provide very interesting definitions of complex concepts such as limited and reasonable assurance and design or operating effectiveness. And naturally, we also draw some vocabulary from the Cybersecurity Act and from other European regulations. So something very important as you go along reading the draft scheme. If something doesn't make sense, it's really crucial to check the glossaries before assuming that there is something wrong. Because we have vocabulary coming from different origins, depending on what your background is, what you are used to, you may be unfamiliar with at least some of the vocabulary that we use, or at least the choices we've made of the definition. So I recommend that you be very careful when actually reading the document by maybe first browsing through the glossaries. There's one at the beginning and there's also one at the end of the document. Make sure that you have the proper definitions for the terms. So before we go into further, we'll go with a little bit of an interlude here about wondering what is the definition of assurance. So in the past year, we have struggled with many definitions like audit, effectiveness, evaluation, and many more. But no definition has been as obscure and disputed as assurance. So let's take a look at this one. So assurance is a very loaded word, and there are many definitions. So Webster's in 1913 defines it as the act of assuring, or a declaration tending to inspire full confidence, that which is designed to give confidence. 1 century later, SOC 2 defined it as an objective examination of evidence for the purpose of providing the reader or user of the report with a level of comfort that security goals have been adequately met through the organization's risk management and governance process. And common criteria around 2000. Common criteria around 2000. Do not actually define what assurance is. They define an assurance level as the grounds for confidence that a tow meets the SFI. So the key point here is that what we're talking about here is about building confidence. So our own definition here is the result of a set of actions to bring some level of confidence that some requirements are met. So this is actually quite abstract, but this is what the scheme is all about now, generating assurance. So I will let you read the definitions here, but what you can see is that assurance is about gathering evidence, it's about building confidence, and it is about reducing risk. So all of this is very human, it's very qualitative. So how can we know that we are there, that we've met our goal? And even better, I mean, how do we know how to define levels? So the method for generating assurance depends on the framework. So if you take, for instance, NIST SP 800, they define requirements on assurance controls that narrow the analysis, for instance, by increasing the discipline applied to a system architecture, software design, specifications, code style, configuration management. So this is interesting. The idea here that some controls can specifically lead to assurance because they give hints on the fact that the provider is basically doing the right thing. In common criteria, the split is even stronger because the requirements are divided between security requirements and assurance requirements. And it happens that these assurance requirements happen to look a lot like what NIST defined as assurance-related control. So these assurance requirements in common criteria also defines requirements for the task to be performed in the evaluation, that is the assessment itself, and they are used to define the evaluation assurance levels, right, by listing the ones that are required. So once we have gathered all this, what is an assurance level? In our case, the Cybersecurity Act gives us a definition. So assurance levels defines the basis for confidence that the service meets the security requirements of the scheme. It indicates the level to which a service has been evaluated, but as such does not measure the security of the service concerned. So at least we have a caveat here, but something that it does not completely do. But if we combine it with what we have seen previously, we can get some ideas about what we want from the assurance levels. First, the idea of assurance is to build confidence that the cloud service meets the requirement defined in the scheme. Here, the requirements will be on the security controls and on the security mechanisms that are implemented in and around the cloud service. And assurance levels must also reflect somehow the level of scrutiny to which the cloud service is submitted. So of course, the main point for us is to figure out how the levels relate to each other. So we take a few hints and say that the high assurance levels are expected to include more assurance-related controls because we want a higher level of assurance. The processes must be better, and these processes must also be applied more strictly. In addition, the assessment requirements also have to increase with the levels. And finally, when certifying service, something similar to actually what happens with products, higher assurance levels are associated to higher functional requirements on the service, about how the security of the service itself is built, because these additional requirements will help to build confidence. So let's now look at how we have defined our assurance levels. The levels are defined through 6 main factors. First, the intention is a high-level description based on the Cybersecurity Act requirements. Suitability is about the potential uses of the assurance levels. The attacker profile is an attempt to slightly refine the description from the Cybersecurity Act, but without going into elaborate details like what happens for common criteria. Finally, scope, depth, and rigor are what is used to define how the levels actually work. So before looking at a quick description of the levels, let's look at the first 2 components here. Let's look at the first 2 components, intention and the suitability, because they are the ones that provide the background about what we intend to do with the levels. So first, the intention. The basic level is defined in the Cybersecurity Act as aiming to minimize the known basic risks of incident of cyber attacks. But this is not very ambitious. It's mostly a first step into certification. Here, in EUCS, it is implemented by a self-assessment, whose results are audited by a third party. Also, the focus is quite narrow, as we look mostly at documentation aspects to verify the existence of procedures and mechanisms that match the requirements of the scheme. The substantial level ups the game quite a bit. We aim to minimize known cybersecurity risk and the risk of incident and cyber attacks carried out by actors with limited skills and resources. So to achieve that, there is now a full-fledged audit performed by the camp. The design and the implementation of the controls and measures is verified to match the requirements of the scheme. In addition, the operating effectiveness is checked over a period of time to make sure that the service and the controls have been operated as expected over that period. Finally, the high level has to deal with more advanced threats, as it aims to minimize the risk of state-of-the-art cyber attacks carried out by actors with significant skills and resources. So the basic characteristics of the assessment are the same as for the substantial level, for the full-fledged audit, including operating effectiveness over a period of time. But the main difference is here in the additions of many additional requirements on security controls, some of them, of course, related to assurance, as we've seen before. For instance, we have additional requirements on the automation of controls and on penetration testing. Now, the suitability. The idea with the basic level is to protect non-critical data and systems, and this basically corresponds to a low-risk profile. The substantial level goes a bit higher because it is intended to protect business-critical data and systems. And it is also intended to be the mainstream risk profile for cloud operations, including some sensitive ones. So the idea here is that the default level, I would say, should be substantial. If you require something, substantial should be okay for what you need. Unless, of course, you have very high requirements, in which case the high level could be there. It's intended to protect mission-critical data and systems. This is a much more elevated risk profile. So the idea here would be to protect data and systems for which the first reactions about, then would be, what? You want to put this in the cloud? Are you sure? And if you ask this kind of question, then maybe this is the right level. And of course, it is more demanding, which means that it could also become more expensive to certify, but also to operate, which means that these costs may also be applied to the customers, of course. Now, let's look a little bit deeper into the levels, and first the basic level. So basic is the first step. It's, as we mentioned, an entry point to the world of certification. The idea here is to appeal to providers who are not certified today, but that have been working on security, and they want to demonstrate their commitment to security, even if they are not completely ready for the higher levels yet. But the general scope of requirements is the same as for the other levels, with the same 20 categories. However, the requirements you'll find at basic are very light. They have very limited obligations to, in particular, fully comply to standards or to use very strict methods. These items, will though be in the guidance. So it is recommended, of course, to do that, because the idea for us is that someone who gets certified at basic should eventually go for the substantial level. Also, some of the themes may be skipped for the basic level, although it's not clear today, and this remains an open question actually in the survey, which you can provide your opinion. The assessment at basic is performed by the cloud service provider himself, following a standard checklist. So it is a self-assessment, but it is an audited self-assessment. The CSP fills the checklist and provides supporting documentation as evidence of the design and evidence also of the existence of the security control and security mechanism. Then the CAB performs an audit of that proposed evidence and may discuss the result of that audit with the CSP. Finally, regarding maintenance, the obligations are rather low, including a yearly reassessment, but a quite limited one, focusing mostly on the changes operated by the CSP on its services and on its security controls. So we also will take a look at the vulnerabilities and incidents that occurred in the previous period to see if they were actually maybe a symptom of something that would need to get fixed. Moving to substantial, the general scope remains the same, but this time the level of details of the requirements is very similar to the basic criteria of the C5. It includes, of course, all the requirements defined by the basic level. They are complemented by the requirements from other sources. Maybe most importantly here, the assessment is a full, reasonable assurance assessment performed by an auditor, and an accredited auditor too. So it is now the auditor's role to gather evidence from documentation, interviews, site visits as needed. Here, it's not just the mere existence of the security measures that is being looked at, but the design of the measures has to be demonstrated appropriate for the requirements of the scheme, and their application over a period of time has to be demonstrated as well. The maintenance is also more demanding because the operating effectiveness needs to be demonstrated over the full period since the last assessment. And we keep, of course, the requirement of making sure that anything that have changed during that period must be also known to be effective. So the design effectiveness has to be demonstrated on all the things that have changed during the period. Maybe one note here about the EU statements of conformity. The EU statements of conformity are not supported in the draft scheme. Cloud service providers, they perform a self-assessment at level basic. You can see that contrast with the substantial, but they are not allowed to make a self-declaration about their conformity to the scheme. The only way to claim conformity is to undergo a certification, and what that entails is that this self-assessment must be audited by an accredited third party before a certificate can be issued by that third party. So our decision not to support EU statements of conformity may not be final. The main reason behind it is that, of course, the scheme is not mature enough to support EU statements of conformity. So in the first months of years, the first assessments will require the experience of professional auditors, in particular to properly apply the guidance that will be also defined on the go. And another point is that the EU statements of conformity, they're quite demanding in terms of surveillance. And in the first years, as the processes are being established, it may be too much of a burden to actually ask the NCCAs to have that level of surveillance. So the decision not to support the EU statements of conformity may be reconsidered when the scheme is reviewed. So of course there is, there are different opinions. Some people say that this never be activated. Some say that this is a good idea. So we'll have the debate again after applying the scheme for a while and after seeing how the basic level in particular works. So to finally hear about the high level, the expectation is to have security controls at the state of the art. So if we want to assess that, the assessment methodology is actually not changed, mostly because this is basically the state of the art in terms of auditing. So we don't want to go much further than that. But the requirements on the security controls and the mechanisms are in different ways. So this basically means that if we remember what we said about assurance, what we'll be working on is actually having more assurance-related controls at the high level. So first, there are, in general, more requirements and more demanding ones. So coming in particular from Secnum Cloud, from the additional criteria of C5, and in some cases from the CSP cert suggestions. Then there are stronger requirements on penetration testing, which applies to all categories following a multi-year testing program. And that testing program is itself in the scope of the audit, leaving the auditor with ways to actually have a close look about what is intended to be done in terms of penetration testing. Finally, there are requirements on the automated monitoring of controls. So in this first version, they only represent a first step, but our intention is clearly to eventually move to continuous assessment for the high level when the technology will be sufficiently available. And when that will happen in future release of the scheme, then there will be, I would say, some differences in terms of the assessment between the level and the substantial level. So hopefully you have a slight idea of our intention now, and we ask ourselves a lot of questions to which we're starting to have a few answers. So the basic level has been designed to be accessible to SMEs. And we have asked the consultant to study how SME could be certified at that level and also at a substantial level, actually. And we will review this work in the coming weeks. Yet the basic level is meaningful. It does force the CSP to ask themselves a lot of questions on relevant topics. There is, of course, no guarantee that they are fully and correctly implemented, but the answers to these questions are verified to be consistent by an auditor. And anybody who went through such a process knows how hard it is to actually build a consistent set of controls. And it's not actually such a small achievement. So the substantial level adds a full audit, which of course is a major difference. It also adds many requirements and references to standards that will need to be applied. So it does provide significantly higher assurance than the basic level. In the end, it should be very similar to existing schemes like C5 and as relevant as these schemes are today. About the high level, the whole question is about finding the right compromise. Right? We want to achieve significantly higher assurance than the substantial level, but the high level still needs to be something that is achievable, that is reachable by cloud services. So we believe that the current proposal achieves that for the high levels and also the objectives for the other levels. So the survey includes these questions and many more, and we would like to have your opinion on that. So now let's look at the assessment. What we have defined in EUCS is an overarching methodology, which defines some common principles. And then the methodology is specialized into two further methodologies, one for level basic, based, as we mentioned, on an audited self-assessment, and one for level substantial and high, based on full audit by the CAB. So without a great surprise, the basic assessment principles follow 17065. So it starts with an application. CSP provides some information about their cloud service and their security controls to the CAB. CAB reviews this information to ensure that the cloud service seems to be certifiable. If that goes well, then the next step is to perform an audit with two important phases. First, you need to build an audit plan and then to execute it. Following that, there is one specific step in which the CAB reviews the assurance that has been made available about sub-services. And we'll look at this one in details later. And finally, an independent team in the CAB needs to review the work done by the audit team and to take a certification decision. So at level basic, the audit is of course quite simple. First, the audit plan is based on a generic checklist, so the preparation of the audit plan is rather simple. Then the assessment is performed by the CSP and delivered to the CAB. So the CAB then audits the analysis and the evidence proposed by the CSP. Of course, depending on the results, there may be more or less interactions and some exchanges between them to fix issues with the assessment or to fix some non-conformities. The end of the assessment is the standard one with the analysis of sub-services and the review. For levels substantial and high, the audit tasks are actually quite different. First, the CAB needs to prepare an audit plan that is specifically suited to the controls and the features of the cloud service. Then the CAB will fully execute that audit plan. The CAB will then maybe warn the CSP of non-conformities encountered in the audit, and there will be an opportunity for the CSP to fix them, of course, if this is feasible in a reasonable time frame, and if this is as agreed with the CAB. This is, like always, followed by the sub-service analysis and the review. So a few more words now about this analysis of the sub-services in the cloud supply chain. This comes from the fact that EUCS covers the full stack of a cloud service. So if there are some sub-services that are used by the cloud service, then they are in scope. So the first thing is that the interface between the cloud service to be certified and its sub-services must be properly defined, of course, in terms of security. And it needs to be properly implemented by the cloud service. So this item here is part of the main audit. This is making sure that the cloud service does things correctly. But then appropriate assurance documentation must be provided about the subservice, because we need to be able to ensure that that subservice meets the requirements of the EUCS scheme. For the basic level, this is not very demanding, except that the EUCS requirements are rather wide, so we need to have documentation that covers all of this. At the substantial level, things are getting harder, and you will need a good level of assurance, like at least 27,001 certificates, the 3402 reports, maybe some combinations of some reports, with the proper scope. It's quite likely for substantial that the scope will be the most difficult point. And if you go to high level, then the scope issue becomes really hard because of the high level of requirements in the EUCS, which is actually quite unusual in other schemes. So it will be hard to find pre-existing documentation, and subservice providers will need either to do specific work to support their customers or to themselves get certified on EUCS. And that brings us to composition. So here, composition is defined as a way to simplify the subservice analysis in the case where the subservice holds an EUCS certificate, of course at the right level, and that a few conditions are verified. So first, the subservice must fulfill specific requirements, in particular about the documentation made available to their customers, and in particular to these customers who want themselves to develop cloud services that will get certified. And we'll have more on that later. Then the customers need to follow the recommendations in this documentation, of course. And if that happens, then the documentation of the certified subservice is automatically validated through composition. So the idea here is that instead of having an analysis of documentation about a subservice, there will simply be a list of additional requirements related to that subservice that the cloud service provider will need to implement. That is how composition is supposed to work. Okay, so now let's try to look at what we've been doing with the requirements on security controls. The requirements are defined at quite a high level of abstraction, mostly because they will be annexed to the implementing act, becoming law, and that means that this is not something that can evolve very fast and very easily. So that high level of abstraction will also allow cloud service providers to innovate or to use specific tools, provided, of course, that they justify how they reach the required level of security. And then we will complement these by guidance that will define this required level of security by offering a reference for meeting the requirements. So the CSPs who follow the guidance will not need such a justification that their controls and mechanisms are sufficient. The organization of the requirements loosely follows the 27001 structure, and they include important cross-references that are quite important. The most common one that you will read several times, which is document, communicate, and implement policies and procedures according to ISP 02, is a shortcut to say that anything defined in the ISP 02 category applies, so that the policy shall define roles, steps, legal requirements, how it shall be approved, how it shall be revised, and more. So this is a very significant shortcut here. So you have to consider that when looking at the requirements, because it entails many things, like, for instance, the requirement to revise the policies and procedures every year. So finally, the requirements are split on assurance levels. So when certify service at level basic, only the requirements level basic are relevant. At level substantial, Any requirement labeled basic or substantial is relevant. And at level high, of course, well, all requirements are relevant. So when you look at security controls or requirements, they kind of all look the same. So, but building a new set of requirements that match specific needs is not that easy. So when working on requirements and trying to meet our need of having requirements that adapt to a multi-level organization, we initially struggled to build a reference from scratch, taking from the various sources, and in particular, I would say the consistency of the results was not satisfactory. So to simplify things, we decided to use C5 as a basis for the structure, mostly to make it easier to reach consistency, but we still included important views from the other sources, in particular from Segment Cloud and from the CSP cert report. So as we mentioned earlier, we also made an effort to make the presentation of the requirements even more formal and more consistent than they are in C5. So in particular with the vocabulary. And we have focused solely on requirements, leaving the guidance, explanations, and best practices aside for now. That will have to be defined later. So if you are used to C5, the organization of requirements will not be shocking. But don't assume that it is identical, because there are quite a few significant changes to be considered in a number of categories. Now, let's look at what we've been trying to do with these requirements on control. So, sorry for that. In C5, a basic criterion is a complex paragraph. It's made of several statements. They're shown here in different shades of blue. In some cases, there's also an additional criterion, here shown in red, which is optional in C5. So in EUCS, each of these statements, if we have decided to reuse it, becomes a requirement that may be more or less rewritten. And we assign to each one of them an assurance level. So in typical case, the most high-level statement becomes a basic requirement, and the more detailed ones are assigned to the substantial level. There are additional criteria. So when they are considered, such as the case here, they become a requirement from level high. And in addition, we may be adding some requirements from other sources because they cover some things that were not appropriately covered in C5. Here, we have a requirement that is imported from Segment Cloud. It is here at substantial, but in many cases, the Segment Cloud requirements end up at level high. So in the end, a theme looks pretty much like this. So we have a number and title. We have a high-level objectives that defines what we're trying to achieve with the requirements, which is something that the auditors may also want to get back to, in particular when analyzing non-conformities. And a list of requirements that come from various origins. So in some cases here, we also have, in addition to the requirements, a hint of the information that will need to be included in the guidance. So it's not really the guidance itself, it's more about indicating that, yes, we intend really to define, for instance, something that mentions state of the art, and we will define what this state of the art thing means in the guidance. So to conclude on the requirements, I have a word on the documentation category. So a very strong guiding idea behind the scheme is to make enough information available to the customers of cloud services to let them make informed decisions about security. So documentation is here very important. The first set of requirements are about the service documentation. This documentation has to be publicly available, as this is a requirement from the Cybersecurity Act. We have added some details. So for instance, we require enough information to perform a risk analysis at level substantial, and also require services that are certified at level high to regularly analyze how their customers actually follow the recommendations and to perform actions to improve compliance. So on the side note here regarding level high, this is really how this level is built through an accumulation of requirements like this, which actually make a real difference, especially when they are considered all together. This analysis of the consumer behavior and the fact that some actions are required to improve it is something that is a significant difference. The Cybersecurity Act also requires other things like register of vulnerabilities, which is here defined by requiring more specific information, in particular related to how customers may perform their risk analysis. However, we don't cover all of Article 55 here. For instance, things about vulnerability disclosure is covered elsewhere about the vulnerability assessment. Sorry, vulnerability handling chapter. So the third set of requirements are about locations and data processing and storage, and are very important. All certified cloud services need to be transparent about where the data is stored and processed and about applicable jurisdiction. At the higher levels, you also need additional information about administration, supervision, about metadata and derived data. That's for substantial. And at high, you also need details about the support operations. So because this is a transparency requirement, this of course will be publicly available. So you'll find this information in the templates for the publicly available documents associated to the certificate. But this is one of the things that we still need to completely, fully define. Yeah. Then there's a need for justifying the targeted assurance level. That also needs to be transparent, at least as a summary. But the idea here is to include a full justification, but to make sure that a summary of that justification is available to the potential customers, so they can see how the cloud service providers sees and analyzes the security of its own service. So the final two requirements, they are optional, and they are the requirements that we mentioned earlier when talking about composition. So you need to do that if a service is intended to be used as a subservice in composition. In that case, the cloud service provider must give information that is relevant not only to the secure use of their service, but also to get another service certified on top of their service. In particular, the main difference here is that we will have stronger requirements about how the customer guidelines are expressed to make sure that we have actionable requirements, which can of course also be audited, and that these requirements are assigned to assurance levels when that is relevant. The idea being, of course, to make sure that this can later be easily audited. The CSP will also describe how the service contributes to the security of its customers' services. The idea is that this documentation would normally be required from the customer as an explanation of how they use the subservice, but here they don't have to do it because this is provided by the subservice provider. And these two requirements taken together are the ones that enable composition to happen. Finally, something very important also about these documentation requirements is that they are fully part of the conformity assessments, so they will be audited. That means that all the documents listed here, they're on the scope of the audit, so that provides some guarantees that the publicly available documents are trustworthy. So to conclude, let's now take a look at what lies ahead of us, in addition to listening to feedback and finalizing the scheme. So first and foremost, we have accreditation and authorization. In order to match the requirements from the industry, we have defined conformity assessment scheme that can be combined with existing ones, but is entirely new. So that means that we need to define how national accreditation bodies will certify the cabs. But these discussions are just starting, and we have a seminar planned in January to discuss that with NABs. Authorization is a complement that is defined in the Cybersecurity Act. It complements accreditation, where the NCCA assesses the level of competence of the cabs on technical topics. So of course, in our scheme, there are a few obvious topics like penetration testing, code analysis, some things that are required for level 5. But we need to figure out if more topics need to be covered, maybe possibly topics for the lower levels. And this is also a discussion that we will have with the NAVs, but also with the member states through the ECCG. Another challenge that we have and that we're very careful about is the applicability of the scheme with, I would say, two main questions there. First is on the SMEs. Is the scheme accessible? At which level? So we definitely hope that SMEs can get a basic or a substantial certificate for their cloud services. We don't intend that to be particularly easy. It's not intended to be. You cannot get certified if you have not reached a good level of maturity on security. That's it. But in many other schemes, there are many SMEs that are successful in certifying their products or services. And we're exploring what it takes and how we can adapt it to the scheme. So in many cases, the small size of an SME simplifies many aspects of security because its organization is simple, because its premises are small, etc. So for the smallest SMEs, it is quite likely also that they do not operate the infrastructure, which covers, of course, the most difficult constraint. And composition can also help significantly. So we'll look at that also later this month in the working group. About the high level, the questions, as we mentioned before, are on both sides. Is it enough? Is it not too much? So this, the work that we still need to do, and that which you can contribute as well, is to take a closer look at the specific topics. So how is the path to continuous assessment? Have we made the right choices here? About penetration testing also, how are we doing there? Is that the appropriate way of dealing with penetration testing? But we also need, in particular, to consider the consistency of all the smaller requirements that make the level high, and understand how they connect to each other and how they build a higher level of assurance. So this is something that we need to do. So we'll do that in the working group, of course, and we'll make sure that we incorporate, of course, the feedback from the community. The next challenge that we talked about a few times today is the cloud supply chain. We know that many cloud services are built using other services, sometimes many other services, and in particular, other cloud services. So in some cases, this may simplify the work to be done, but in other cases where assurance documentation is missing or is a bit difficult to understand, it may make it difficult or maybe impossible. Just like for SMEs, there are limits. If you rely on an infrastructure provider from Albania with no security track records, no reports, no certificates, there's nothing we can do. But in most cases, infrastructure providers are not in such a bad situation, and we must find the right level of requirements. We must refine the procedures that have been defined. We have to play with them and experiment. And this is something that will most likely be split between maybe a few updates to the scheme itself and specific and dedicated guidance for the auditors on how to deal with various kinds of assurance documentation. Also, in terms of the supply chain, we have a chicken and egg problem with composition, of course. It is expected to make things easier for lots of cloud service providers, but of course it cannot help before we have a significant number of EUCS certificates for infrastructure providers. In the meantime, what we need to ensure is that the investment from vendors in existing schemes, in particular from the national schemes from member states, can be leveraged through a transition mechanism. So we need to define this transition mechanism, and in particular how the certificates or reports from these other schemes can be exploited in EUCS. So there is plenty of work with 3 threads that run at least partly in parallel ahead of us. First, we must enhance the current draft, and we need your help because your feedback is going to make it better. Then we need to experiment. We need to try out all of these new things that we have defined before they become a law. So experiments means that we identify some key use cases, some CABs, some CSPs that are willing to experiment, that we look at the security controls and how they meet the requirements, and basically experiment with the assessment procedures. And finally, we need to refine everything that we have written and write the guidance that will support the scheme. So we don't know completely yet how this will be done. There will be a mix of reuse of existing guidance that has been, for instance, written by member states, but also development of new guidance. And this is something that will happen through a process that will become the process or structure for actually the maintenance of the scheme. But last but not least, EUCS must be useful. Our goal here is to increase the security of cloud services, to recognize the efforts made by the vendors who get the services certified, and to inform customers. It is not about creating armies of bug stickers everywhere. So the multiple levels that are defined in the Cybersecurity Act, they've been quite a daunting challenge for all of us, but big advantage they have is that they define a progression path for all actors, and hopefully the availability of a basic level will encourage more vendors to venture into the path of certification and later to climb the levels. Also, the scheme is abstract, but the entire community needs now to work together to make it useful. So this scheme is, of course, about convincing knowledgeable auditors that security is adequate, but the actual result will depend on many things. It will depend on the guidance we write. It will depend on how the NCCAs and the CABs implement the scheme, and on how the scheme evolves over time. And we need to make sure that this happens correctly. Finally, we also want to give back to the community. The assurance levels have been an issue, but they are part of the Cybersecurity Act, and there will be an issue for all the schemes to come that want to tackle assurance levels. So maybe parts of the scheme could make their way somehow into standards, maybe around requirements, also around the assessment methods. The scheme, finally, it's together with this guidance, will provide the basis for the development of best practices. We hope that we're able to do that, and also to, of course, to encourage cloud service providers to reach a better level of security. So that's it for this presentation. Thank you for your attention. And I would also like to extend here thank you to all the contributors from the ad hoc working group, from the member states, from the European institutions, and also to all my ENISA colleagues who made this happen. So what I suggest now is that we have a small break, and so we'll take maybe 15 minutes so that we can sort out your questions before we have that. In the meantime, I think we'll open the poll about the webinar. Of course, we appreciate to have some answers about this poll, but something important here that we've had some issues with the registration to this event. So if you wish to be contacted in relationship to this scheme following this event, please answer to the poll, at least the last question with a yes. So see you in 15 minutes for the answer to the questions. Thank you very much.
Hello, so we are back for the Q&A session. So we received many questions, so we'll try to cover all your concerns. Yeah. So we'll start now. Eric is also online. Yes.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Okay, perfect. So the first question would be about the project timeline itself. What would be the next steps?
So the timeline for the ongoing work is not as clear right now about everything. So the first thing is, of course, we'll get the results of the review at the beginning of February. Then we will, with the ad hoc working group and with the ECCG, we will refine the scheme as mentioned, and then eventually the idea would be to resubmit it to the ECCG for an official opinion, and then to get it to the commission, to deliver it to the commission so that they can start working on the implementing act. So when we look at that, looking at what is happening with the EUCS scheme, which is the first scheme that has gone through this process, it takes actually quite a while. So it will take somewhere between maybe 4 or 6, maybe even a few more months, depending on the time we spend actually working on the scheme again. But then that will be, I would say, the first step when we start having the draft scheme, and then the next steps are to have the commission work on the implementing act, then to have this implementing act go through a committee nominated by the member states, and then finally voted on it. And that's only when we'll start having a scheme. So in parallel with that, this is when we will work on the guidance and on all the additional things that need to be organized. Also, because this is one of the first schemes to happen, we also need to make sure that before we can issue certificates, the NCCAs must be in place in the member states, ready to operate, ready to issue certificates, but also ready to monitor the whole process, because the NCCAs are in charge of actually doing the surveillance of the certificates. So overall, I think the idea about the timeline is that giving at least a 1 year time before we issue the first certificate, and then after issuing the first certificate, at least another year before we for a transition during which the national schemes will still be operating as usual. Hopefully this is enough, but something important to remember here is that this is still one of the first schemes that is being worked on, and that so far there is no scheme that is operating under the Cybersecurity Act. So it's quite hard to have detailed number, because we don't have a full view about how the process happens and how things will move also for the rest of the infrastructure, like NCCA is being set up.
Okay, thanks. So next question will cover the accreditation bodies. So who are they? Who are the accreditators, and will you provide a training for it?
So in terms of the accreditation there, so the person in charge of doing the accreditations are the NABs, the national accreditation bodies. So the way that works is that you first go to the accreditation body when you are a CAB, and demonstrate with them. You have actually a conformity assessment of the CAB to determine whether they satisfy the rules that we still have actually to define there. So the rules that we'll define, they will be based on the ISO IEC 17065 rules, on which we will define our own set of rules. So the idea here is that we will find something that will be compatible with both the practices in 17021 for ISO 27001 certifications, but also with ISAE rules for more the 3402 kind of certifications. So then there will be, of course, a list of authorized CABs, one per country here. And so that list will be made available during, I would say, the year between, I would say, the scheme becomes available and when before the first certificate is issued. In terms of training programs from consultants and auditors, I think these things exist already. I mean, there are people doing ISO 27001 audits. There are people doing ISAE audits. All these people, they have normally the more or less the proper expertise, if they have also the cloud background. So there exists, of course, an offer of things for that, but it will not be anything, I would say, specific for that scheme immediately. Also, about the notion of difference maybe between a CAB and an audit firm. Here, I think the main difference is that an audit firm issues a report. So the report can say whatever it wants. The report is self-contained. It defines everything that all the context in which the report was written. Whereas in context of a CAB, it issues a certificate, which basically is much more constrained in the sense that it has to satisfy all the requirements of the scheme. It has to follow exactly all the requirements of the scheme as well. So this is really something that is slightly more constrained. And also in terms of accreditation, it will be different. So there's no problem about an audit firm getting accredited to becoming a CAB, but they will have to become a CAB and to do all the business of issuing certificates. And I think there was another question related to CABs there. It was about monitoring the performance of the CABs and of their assessors. So this is something very important. So this is done, of course, by the NABs as part of the follow-up of the certification, the accreditation of the CABs. But it's also part of the responsibility of the NCCA in the context of the Cybersecurity Act to make sure that the CABs actually follow the requirements of the scheme. And if you look in the draft candidate scheme, I think you will find something, I think in chapter 11, about the processes that the NCCA is supposed to put in place to actually make sure that this happens.
Eric, you have one question. You said, maybe it was a mistake, one CAB per country. That's not the case.
No, one list per country. There will be a list published, but of course we will have also a full list in the, we will have a copy of these lists in the ENISA website as well. But only you have to go to the to say a cab in your country. So that's why this is this is the national accreditation bodies doing that in every country. So each NAB has its own list of cabs that are accredited for a particular scheme.
Okay, thanks. So we have lots of questions regarding the different levels of assurance. So, like, how did we consider the risk versus the level of insurance assurance? So could you detail a bit?
Yes.
Yeah, between basics.
Yes. So looking at the questions around this topic here. So there was one about the levels consider the security maturity of vendors, whether it should be risk oriented. So yes, naturally, the definition of levels is risk oriented, and this is what makes things. But what I wanted to say here is not that we will particularly look at the security maturity of vendors. It means that if a vendor is not mature in terms of security, there's no way they will pass, because the problem they will have is that they will not be able to meet the requirements. So I think that the security maturity is not something that is a requirement, it's more of a prerequisite. If you look at the requirements for BASIC, you still need to have quite a lot of structured policies, procedures in place. You need to have a good level of security in terms of the features of your cloud service as well. And I don't think you can achieve that if you don't have at least a good level, a good maturity level on security. There were also some questions about the limits maybe of the high level, saying that would the state of the art or the significant skills and resources cover protections against well-funded state actors? No. We're not here talking about the highest possible level. So there's definitely room for high plus kinds of certifications. So if you are under attack by a more or less infinitely funded state actor, we're not providing the right level of security. You will have to go a bit higher than what can be proven using this scheme here. But then in that case, we're getting more into, I would say, the national security and related questions, which are kind of out of scope from the Cybersecurity Act.
Okay.
Let me. I will continue on this one. I'm just looking at the questions that we have. So there was also one question about the fact that even at the high level, security assurance seems to be retroactive. So not exactly. I mean, it's not retroactive. It's both. So there is a need to actually demonstrate that the design is correct, which means that you need to demonstrate that your system operates correctly, that it operates correctly today, and hopefully, of course, that will continue tomorrow. But I would say that the important level of proof that we're doing by looking retroactively to the previous period is to make sure that, in addition to being well designed, the controls actually have operated correctly over the past period. I think this is, I would say, an additional layer of assurance, in addition to making sure that they are designed correctly and maybe operating correctly today. So this is not solely retroactive. It's just that we cannot really look into the future. So what we're doing is looking at what has happened in the immediate past to make sure that so far it has operated well. And there's also a minimum requirement. So, for instance, even when you get the first certification, I think a substantial would suggest to have at least 3 months of history, and at high 6 months of history for a control. And finally, about BASIC, I think there was some confusion possibly about having both a self-assessment and an audit done in parallel, or an external review. This is actually an external review of a self-assessment. So it's the CSP doing an assessment of their own work, And then there is an external review. And this external review is really, intended to make sure that, we have some, strong, quality control on the kind of assessment that is being done here. And I think that was it around this family here.
Yes. We have questions on the continuous delivery and how the certification will handle DevOps and Agile development.
Yes, so of course, when you go into agile development, you get into situations where the delivery cadence can be weekly, monthly, daily, hourly, whatever. Of course, this is covered here. So the idea in the scheme is that what we certify here is the appropriate, the proper, I would say, execution of processes mostly. But there are also, of course, some things about the way security is implemented in the cloud service. But even for that, we also have some an audit of all the development and change management procedures as well to make sure that between two assessments, things are supposed to be under control. So the idea here is that there can be as many releases as are needed between two conformity assessments, so within a year, and the certification is still valid. There is no need to actually go through certification for every release. So maybe there were another question about, I would say, maybe the motivations of CSPs, about the fact that maybe some CSPs may go for the lowest level of assurance, and of course, some cases we may have the risk exposure of the service and the assurance levels that don't match. So here there's a limit to what we can do. So what we have chosen to do so far is that part of the transparency information will be the a rationale about selecting the level. So the CSP needs to explain why they believe this is the appropriate level for their cloud service. Now, we cannot go much further than that. So this is something that will be available to the customers. But also, I think that this thing will be mostly handled through market requirements. I would not be surprised if not too long after this scheme becomes active, we start seeing requirements, whether it's on, it's in the procurement contracts or procurement, or actually maybe even in regulation about mandating some certification being available. I think this is how this should be handled, whereas the customers have a role in saying, no, for what I want to do, I want a service to be certified at that level. So this is something that should somehow kind of regulate itself. The next question?
Yeah, so so today we have a landscape of certification already existing. How do the new cloud certification will integrate this landscape? We're talking about C5, for example, ISO 27001. Yeah, how will we be able to puzzle with existing standards and certification?
Yeah. Okay, so here there are different categories of this. First, we have some national schemes that have been identified as being somehow equivalent, or being operating on equivalent scope and kind kinds of services. So those are Secnum Cloud in France, C5 in Germany, and Zeker Online in the Netherlands. So for those schemes, the idea is that after some delay, now the proposal is 12 months, but that could be extended to maybe 18 months or 2 years after the first certificates are being issued. These schemes are supposed to be replaced by the European scheme. Now, what that means depends a lot on the actual use of the scheme. So I will take the example of the French Secnum Cloud. So the Secnum Cloud is used, of course, as a way to certify services, but it's also used somehow as a tool for the procurement of the French government. So what we would expect to happen in that case is that Secnum Cloud would not necessarily disappear, but it will be modified. So if everything goes well, then they will not, of course, require the same thing as the scheme. They will ask for the services to be certified at a certain level in the European scheme. And then they would ask their own requirements for the procurement for the French government. So if you look at the current Secnum Cloud, those are requirements that mentions customers and the relationship with the customer, etc., that we have actually not considered in the current draft for the scheme, because they're mostly actually related to this procurement, I think, rather than the actual cybersecurity itself. So, and it's going to be the same with C5 and Zeker Online. It's the governments who decide what they have to do with it. Now, if we consider things like 27001 or 3402, I guess that these things will keep on happening because they're related also to other kind of requirements. So they're required elsewhere. And what we're doing here, and that's been one of the key goals of the definition of the assessment methods, is to ensure that if you used to have something based on ISO IC 27001, or if you used to do regularly in ISA 3402, or if you have to, maybe for regulatory reasons, then it should be rather easy to integrate into your certification strategy the scheme for cloud services. So the idea here is that this scheme will not disrupt your strategy. It can be complementary without asking you to redo something completely new. So the idea would be, for instance, if you used to do a yearly 3402 report, then when you do that report, by just making sure that you cover the scope of requirements from the scheme, and that, of course, your auditor is also an accredited CAP, then you may get two things at the same time. So you can work together at the same time for your 3402 report and for your EUCS certificate.
You mentioned the national certification. Do we expect transition? What would be the time frame
Yeah, so the time frame is not completely clear yet. So the one initial proposal, I think that was 1 year. That may be a little bit too short. So I think that there's actually a question here on the survey about how long that would be required, because of course, as long as the two survive in parallel, you may have to do the work twice. So it's going to be something that's a bit tricky. So so if the time is short, you get the advantage of not doing double work too long. But then the transition may be a bit brutal. If it's longer, then the transition is softer, but you may have to do a little bit of double work. So there's no perfect solution. And this is also why this is one of the questions also in the survey. Yeah.
Okay, we'll move to a question regarding the evaluation itself. How will it be led? Is there like on-site audits? What is planned for that?
So sorry, can you repeat the question?
How will the evaluation will be led?
Okay, so
yeah. Does it include on-site audits too?
Yeah. So the evaluation will follow the plan of an evaluation of a 17065 audit. So of course, at the basic level, it's different, as you mentioned, because this is a more or less a self-assessment. So in that case, there's an assessment performed internally by the CSP that is then audited in the last phase by the auditor. But you are going for a substantial or high, then there will be an auditor that will do the same things, I would say, that would have be expected to happen in a usual kind of audit. So, for instance, you may expect to have maybe some documentation review, and then that would be followed by some site visits, also some interviews with some personnel. So all of these should be actually planned carefully in the audit planning phase. So at least so far in the scheme itself, we remain quite abstract about what is needed here. So there will be some a bit further refinements about that, about how in particular, what minimum requirements there will be, but there will be also some additional guidance about, in particular, combining the certification with different kinds of other certifications and making sure that it mixes well with, for instance, a 17 or 21 kind of audit for 27001 or a 3402 audit. So those will be a little bit refined in the candidate scheme, but mostly later through guidance.
What about the automatic monitoring you're mentioning? How this will is this limited to cybersecurity, or what is the scope of it?
Yes, so the automated monitoring. So the idea here is, as you mentioned, is that this is the first step towards continuous assessment. So continuous assessment is something that a lot of actors in cloud computing are working on right now, trying to figure out how they can do some action so that they make sure, kind of live, that the security controls are properly implemented, and that also there can be some feedback loop with the particularly with the CAB, for instance, in that case. So this is not mature for now. There are R&D projects about that. There are people who have started to define it. So what we've chosen to do as a first step is to require for some controls some automated monitoring of these controls. So in our particular case here, it's really only dedicated to some of the controls, typically those that can be automated, where there can be fairly easily a monitoring that is performed itself automatically, that will make sure that the control is operating correctly. So this is, of course, a first step towards continuous assessment. But if you look at the way it is implemented in the scheme here, it is actually the cloud service provider who's processing any potential non-conformities. So the idea with the automated monitoring of the controls is that when something goes wrong, then the cloud service provider is supposed to be set to assess whether the non-conformity is minor or major. If it's minor, then they have to fix it somehow. If it's major, of course they also have to fix it. But in addition, they have to notify their CAB that they're encountering a major issue with their with one of their controls, and the CAB may decide at this stage that they will, for instance, suspended the certification. So, and then they may decide that maybe some specific conformity assessment will be required to make sure that the fix was correct, etc., etc. So the main constraint here is that when you're at the high level, you have, and on all the controls for which you have automated monitoring, you need to be yourself looking at your controls and dealing with the non-conformities appropriately. And of course, on your yearly assessment, we think that the CAB would take a close look at anything that came out of automated monitoring and that was classified as being a minor non-conformity to make sure that they were indeed minor. And they would also take a close look at any non-conformity or problem that happened with these controls and was actually not flagged by the automated monitoring. And the idea is again being to gradually improve this. And so this is the first step where there is a lot of manual things involved, in particular with the interaction between the cloud service provider and the CAB. But the idea is that in the future, we will be able to extend these requirements to make these interfaces more automated so that the CAB can be notified more automatically when something wrong happens, and be notified also, of course, of how it is being resolved. So they can have a more interactive way of actually monitoring the security of the cloud services that they have certified. But of course, beyond the technical problems, this also brings some, say, business model issues, because of course then there is, I would say, regular work to be done by the CAB, so this has to be dealt with as well. So say this is at best for the second release of the scheme.
Thanks. Actually the scheme involve pen testing for the high level of assurance. Will this be detailed in the guidances? What will be the methodology applied for the pen test, and what is expected from the CAB or CSP regarding that?
Yes, so so the guidance will in particular define a few things like state of the art. But state of the art today, if you're familiar with getting certified anywhere in Europe, you will note that member states typically define what state of the art is. So this is something that is being done by ANSI for Second Cloud, by BSI for C5, etc., etc. So the intention here for the guidance is to first work with the ECCG for things like the state of the art, things that are currently and typically defined by member states, so that we can see how we will define the state of the art for the cloud scheme. So here I cannot tell you in advance what the results of the discussions will be, but basically two solutions that are possible, and that we may want to refer to some existing national recommendations, or we may want to build an harmonized guidance or state-of-the-art definition for the scheme, or something at the European level. So, for instance, such a kind of a harmonized guidance exists for some topics that are relevant, in particular, to the EUCS scheme. So this is something that could happen also with the cloud services, but it's hard right now to define, I would say, the exact time frame for this harmonization to actually happen. Now, for the rest of the guidance, things that are, I would say, not defined today in existing documentation, and this is something that we'll have to define together with the scheme, or maybe right after the scheme, or at the end of the work. And this is something also that will need to be maintained over time. So this is not a one-shot work guidance, and this is actually the main reason for separating it out from the scheme, because the scheme itself is something that will evolve slowly. That is expected to be revised on a regular basis, but the regular basis being multiple years between releases of a scheme, whereas guidance may need to evolve much faster than that. If new threats happen, if problems occur with algorithms, if maybe new things also happens. I mean, cloud technology evolves fast, so maybe we'll need to have guidance on things that don't even exist today within 1 year from now. So these things need to evolve much faster. So once again, this is something that was set up previously for the SOG-IS, which has become now the EUCC, where they have industrial players together with member states who were deciding how actually things were supposed to be evolving over time, and how they were working together on the guidance. And we will need to have a similar kind of structure to be established for EUCS. So I'm not sure whether we will first have a first draft or first set of guidance documents, and then we will establish the maintenance structure, or if it will go the other way around, which is that we first define a structure and then use it to issue even the first set of guidance. But this is something that, once again, will be under discussion this coming month, particularly with the member states. So this should clarify actually quite soon about how we will vote and write the guidance.
Great. We have very specific question on some requirements from the scheme itself. I don't know if we should answer them here. We have 4 questions about them. Maybe because I think it's the same person that asked them.
Yeah, I think I would maybe it's better to ask to answer that offline. I would
Yeah,
say.
if this person can contact us directly, I have the name, but in case I missed it, you can send an email to certification@enisa.europa.eu, and we'll make sure to answer these specific questions. Now we have also a question regarding the content of the certification decision itself, either it's positive or negative. What will be public, and what happens in case we lose it.
I'm sorry, can you repeat? I didn't hear that correctly. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so the content of a certification decision, and what happens when we lose the certification, or it's not renewed, how is it published, and what information is in it?
Yeah, so yes, this is something that is actually quite important here. So if you're used in particular if you looked at how the EUCC scheme manages certificates, here it's quite different. So because, as we mentioned earlier, you don't have to get a new certificate for every new version. In terms of the timing, things are very different. The way time works on the certification is quite different. Here, you may lose a certification not because you have some particular vulnerability that's a bit bad, but mostly because when a vulnerability occurred, you did not apply either the scheme's rules or your own security controls. Because in both cases, then you at the risk of being suspended, and if you don't fix things in time during the suspension, even having your certificate withdrawn. So these kind of things can happen. And about the publicity, yes, of course, those will be very public. So, I mean, all the certificates will be centralized in ENISA's website, and I think that will offer some things like the ability for customers of a particular cloud service to to get automatic notifications when something happened to the certificate. So that means that the customers who have registered there will be automatically notified when the certificate is suspended or if it is withdrawn. And yes, and they will have to do something about it. So the idea here is that when we suspend certificate, the idea is not that the certificate is not working at all. When you suspend, there's usually a very specific reason for that. And of course, the notification of the suspension will have to explain what this reason is, and also what the users of that service should do during the suspension. So if there is some control that is not working for some reason, then there will be some mitigating actions to be performed possibly by the customers if they want to fall back into security. But of course, the idea about a suspension is that eventually the non-conformity is fixed and the service gets back to normal, being normally certified. So the idea regarding the certificates here is that mostly, as long as the certificate does not say modify, does not remove items from its scope, then it should be, the certificate can live for quite a long time. So it is that if you lower the level of security, if you remove, decide to remove some of the controls without replacing them with something equivalent or higher, or if suddenly you decide that I don't want to be substantial now, I'll be basic, then if these kind of things happen, then this is not considered as being maintenance. And in that case, the certificate, the existing certificate would be withdrawn, and a new certificate would be issued with the reduced scope. So this is the main case for that. So once again, all of this is explained in detail in the chapter 12 of the draft scheme.
Okay. Question. So we talked about all the certification earlier that already exists. What would be the added value of the European Cybersecurity Certification of Cloud Services? Why CSP would request such a certification?
So I would say that there are a few reasons for that. So one of them, of course, is the idea of the European scheme is to replace or at least be the basis for all the national schemes. So the idea, we hope, is that of course the scheme would be referenced by a lot of actors, in particular state actors, in their procurement. So I'd say that would be a good incentive. And even if it's not made mandatory, I think that because the scheme will be accepted by a majority of the member states, if it makes it to that point, and then they start issuing certificates, then also means that even if it's not mandatory, it will be likely a good reference when you want to work with state actors or large actors in Europe. Of course, this is also transitive, so if you want to work for someone who wants to work with the state actors, then maybe they will have some requirements also to have a certified scheme. And I think this is something that will be quite likely the main reason for actually getting certified, which is the market demand.
Do we have an idea of the cost of the certification?
Good question. No. No, I don't have an idea of the exact costs of the certification. Now, as we've been saying, the level substantial, for instance, is supposed to be equivalent to some kind of C5. So we would expect to be in the same ballpark, in the same range. So we wouldn't expect it to be 5 times more expensive or 5 times cheaper. So it may be 20% more expensive, 20% cheaper, I don't know, but it should be in the same range. We are actually working actively, and this is one of the experiments that we want to make, and on figuring out how we can put some proper limits on what it means to get certified at level basic, because I think this is the level for which cost sensitivity will be the highest. For level high, I'm actually not sure that in terms of cost, there will be two things in terms of cost for sure. One of them will be the cost of actually getting certified, I mean paying the CAB. I think that this will be rather small compared to the costs of operating a service that satisfies these requirements. So if you decide to have a service that satisfies the requirements of level high, that is that you're running a lot of sophisticated processes with all the tiny little requirements that we put in addition to that, I would say that it would definitely make sense to get certified, because if you decide to do this and to have a higher level of security, you of course will want to talk to customers that are very sensitive in terms of security, and then the scheme becomes a way to actually get their trust. So because they get a higher level of confidence when they see a proper certificate at a high level. So the costs, I mean, I don't know. They would be, of course, higher than for the substantial. But I would say that the increase would be higher from the cost of operation and from the cost of certification. That's what I would expect. So maybe I will go through maybe a few questions that I've seen that I come maybe a bit later that have attracted my attention. There's one about the public register of known vulnerabilities. So would that mean that the CSP needs to make public disclosures of open vulnerabilities, which seems to be, of course, an insecure practice? No. No. The idea about the public register of known vulnerabilities is that you should have some a register of the vulnerabilities that typically, I would say, are closed. In some cases, they may be open, but I think that would be trouble. But that's basically what I would say most actors are already doing today. So this is not something that is uncommon. We're not asking to go further than the normal practice. It just has to be systematic. And I think this is actually not a requirement of the scheme. This is a requirement of the Cybersecurity Act. So this is not something that is actually in any way negotiable. That had to be negotiated earlier with the Cybersecurity Act. So now we have to include that in the scheme. So, but more generally, of course, there will be some interactions. If you look at the way we handle vulnerabilities, which is chapter 13 or 14, the way it is done is that when something comes up through any kind of channel, internal or external, there must be an analysis of the impact of the vulnerability. And if there is what the CSP considers to be a high impact, then they need, once again, to notify their CABs. So what that means is that, once again, they will have to discuss with the CAB about, hey, what are you doing about that vulnerability? And how they are actually dealing with it. And of course, one thing that will need eventually to be done is to publish it in the known vulnerabilities. But of course, in particular, for instance, if it's something that's been discovered internally, that is not being made public in any way, they will wait until they have a fix before to make it public, most likely. Also, something important about that is that when you report a vulnerability to CAB, they have a requirement, which also comes from the CSA, to actually share that with their NCCA. We in turn have to share that with the other NCCAs. So when you have vulnerability happening, I think that the idea here is to make sure that if something bad happens to one of the cloud services, and in particular if that thing is linked to something they've been using, like another specific software product or some subservice, then it's important to share that information so that if it may affect other cloud services that have been certified, then they can be notified. They will be asked to position themselves with regard to that vulnerability. So once again, this is something that is supposed to be happening in a trusted relationship between the CSPs, the CABs, and the NCCAs. And this is very similar to what is happening today, regarding a lot of disclosures. So if you ask your national authority for help because you have some problem happening, you don't expect them to go and make the thing public without telling you. I think it's the same thing here. You will want to make sure that this process works correctly, but this is something to be defined also by the NCCAs together to the ECCG as they set up the full surveillance infrastructure, because this is part of the surveillance of the scheme.
We have a question about the Cloud Act. How the scheme, Cloud Act or any extraterritorial laws, how the scheme will comply, or how the scheme will manage these extraterritorial laws.
So the scheme is actually, of course, as usual, the scheme is fairly abstract. So if you looked, when I talked about the requirements for transparency, there were requirements for transparency on location and on jurisdiction. So that would be part of that. How that could be part of that. So if you consider that some foreign law applies to even cloud service, then they have to declare it. Now, of course, we're not going to say if you have any tie with the US, you have to talk about the Cloud Act. This is not the role of the scheme. This may turn out to be guidance. This may be something to be discussed first with NCCA, etc. So this is going to be something, of course, that needs to be discussed, on which there needs to be some convergence, but it is not going to be part of the scheme itself. This is something that will need to be discussed as part of a specific guidance, because these kind of things can change with any kind of change in the legal environment. So we have to be reactive, and this is not to be part of the scheme. But the only thing the scheme does is requiring any jurisdiction that applies to be listed, and then have to figure out what that means. I guess it's hard to go more detailed than that at the scheme level. Once again, this is something that may need to be discussed more into guidance.
We have several questions about how to contribute to the scheme itself. Will there be a pilot experimentation? What can be done to improve the draft?
So the first thing that can be done for improving the draft is actually reading the draft and answering the survey. So the survey gives you some opportunity to actually, in addition to answer a few questions, ticking boxes, you can also provide limited free text answers. So I think this is something where you can actually provide some feedback. Of course, in order to, the way we work on the scheme so far, there's a limited number of people there, and we don't intend to augment it before we finalize the work on the scheme. Now, what will happen is that there will be a different structure that will be set up to work on the guidance. So for that next step, there may be some additional participation from other people that will be required. So this will become visible after a while. So hopefully we will have, say, opportunities for more people to actually participate at this stage. So, if you want to participate further, I hope that you accepted to be recontacted about the scheme, because of course, if there is a call for additional participants, if there's such an open call or something like that, then we will make it available. And also, I don't know yet what the level of openness will be on the work on guidance, but I would expect that there would be also some interactions, maybe a little bit more open than what we have here for the review of the scheme itself.
Okay, is the scheme cloud services specific? For example, if we replace clouds by, for example, IoT, it seems that most of the scheme could apply. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so so in terms of reuse in other scheme or interfaces with other schemes, so we have something. There is actually a small paragraph about that. So the idea is that here we're doing something very generic. So this is about the requirement, for generic cloud services. They're supposed to be applicable to every cloud service. So of course, if you move into a particular area, then you have to deal with the specific requirements. So for instance, I think there was a question also on IEC 62443. So if you're looking about, the OT requirements, so maybe there are some additional things that you want to require, and we have actually opened the way for having some security profiles that will allow a given vertical to add requirements to the scheme. So this is something that is actually defined today, the scheme, and the main objective is actually to be able to use that in the future schemes that could be coming. So for instance, been some talks, for instance, about IoT, whether it's generic IoT or industrial IoT, but in both cases, of course, the IoT, the I part of it, is actually in many cases a cloud service. So it would make sense, and most likely, to add specific IoT requirements to that, so that if somebody has an IoT cloud service, they can certify it as being, of course, an appropriate cloud service. In addition, have a few more things to demonstrate as an IoT cloud service, and then that would be sufficient for the cloud aspect things of the for an IoT service. So I think this is something that is planned. Of course, we need to wait for the new schemes to be coming to actually be using that before we see how much and how well it works. Yes. But hopefully, this could happen. We have something there. Yeah.
So does that anything to do with the security profile?
Yes. Yeah. That's what it is. Yes. Security profiles.
Yeah. Could you details a bit what type of security profiles we can expect, and will that be detailed in the guidance also?
So as I say, you typically take the examples of IoT, which can be either the generic IoT or more the security profiles, for instance, for IEC 62443. So those are interesting things. There could be also, I would say, a vertical security profile. So, I mean, for instance, there are already today some requirements, I would say, in the financial area. So we could expect that in the financial world, they come up at some point with something like that. There can be something as well, if you look at the regulated areas like health, where they could benefit from that. But of course, these are the kind of things that can only happen once the scheme is starting to operate, so that they can see how they can actually benefit from having such a security profile defined. Okay, there's a question about suspension, that if CSP is certified at a substantial level and is suspended, but the rationale for such an action is outside of the basic level, would the CSP just drop to basic level? So I would say no, because that would be very confusing, because as we said that dropping to a level in the scheme normally means that you need to issue a new certificate. But I would say that in the rationale for the suspension, it would be, of course, very interesting in such a case to say that the cloud service is not anymore compliant right now with the substantial level, but remains compliant for the basic level, so that if someone relies on it as a basic, then they're still safe. And they keep operating. So this is something that would be part of the information provided by with the suspension, I would say.
Okay, we reached the time. I think it's time to thank you all.
So thank you all for attending this session and for this long monologue here. But I hope that you got some valuable information from this, and hope that it will help you in actually doing some reviewing and contributing and possibly later getting certified with this. So yes, thank you very much, everybody, for attending.